I'm Bianca.
And I'm Grant.
And this is the Lake House Project.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Golden Key Design. Today we're going to lay some tile. So after we laid our Durock, if you want to check out that video, that was last week, but after that's ready to go, we can now start laying our tile, and here's some of the tools that you're going to need. We have our trowel. This is 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. This is specified by our tile size and the type of mortar that we're using. Look up the specifications for your tile mortar because that might change. You might have a V groove and you might have different dimensions. Then we have a grout line cleaner. This is for cleaning out the mortar in your grout line so you can get nice and clean grout lines when you get to that step. Then we have a leveling system, and this is so that the tiles can be at the same height vertically. And then we have the tool for that leveling system. You don't necessarily need this, but if you're going to be doing a large space, for us it's 800 square feet, so it's worth the investment. You're going to want to get one of these. Then we have our tile spacers, so this will space the tiles to make consistently sized grout lines. We're going to be doing 1/8 of an inch grout lines. And then I also have some sponges here. These are going to be used for the grout, but also we're going to be wetting the Durock prior to installing the tiles with our mortar so that the mortar doesn't seep into the Durock, it stays on the surface. And lastly, here's the tile that we'll be using. This is 12 by 24 inch Summit Creek tile. It's a nice textured finish, so it kind of scatters the light and it's not super glossy. You're not going to see a bunch of sun rays hitting off of it and getting you in the eyes. And also it's nice with the texture on your feet as well. So let's get started.
After snapping a chalk line to get the first row started, we mixed up some mortar. I highly recommend buying a paddle mixer. I'll link this one down in the description. And here's a little hack to clean off the paddle once you're done mixing. Then it was time to start laying tile. Here you don't want to put too much mortar over the edge of your chalk line as it's going to be used as your reference line. However, here I used a laser to help me out. And this line, or this row, is extremely important as it will become the reference point for all the other rows on the floor. So you want to take your time with this one and make sure it's nice and straight. Before laying your tile, you want to wet the surface with a sponge, and then you can take your mortar out of your bucket and use your trowel to spread it out and get those nice ridges. Once that's done, you can grab your spacers or your levelers, put those in place, and then put down your tile. And then I use that tool there to slide in those ramps and clamp them down to make sure the tile's all at the same level. "24 hours later, you can kick off all those ramps.
Alright, so we've put a good amount of tile down and we got our rows nice and straight, so now we can just reference off of those. So it should go a little bit quicker. And then what I like to do is to just lay out all the materials that we'll need ahead of time, especially if you're not working with more than 2 people. It's a lot easier to have this laid out for you so you don't have to scramble for it as you're laying the tile. And so we have our levelers that we'll put in with the mortar being wet. We have the ramps that allow the levelers to pull the tile up to the same height. And we also have our spacers for 1/8 inch spacing in between the tiles. If you're doing 16th inch, you can use these as your spacers. However, we decided to do an 1/8 inch, so we're using these levelers as well as spacers. So it's a little bit extra work, but we think we prefer the 1/8 inch grout line. So let's get to work.
Definitely helps to have 2 people working on this, as one person can lay the tile and the other person can back butter the tile before it's laid, which is what my dad is doing, which is basically spreading a thin layer of mortar on the back of the tile. Another tip is that after you're done spreading out your mortar, you're going to want to take a little bit away from the edge up against the tile as I did there. That way when you put down your new piece of tile, the mortar isn't coming up through the grout joints, because that's going to be a lot more to clean later. And now it's kind of a rinse and repeat process. After you let your mortar dry, you can kick off all of those ramps and kind of repeat the process over again. But as you take away those ramps, you're going to want to keep those yellow ramps, but you can throw out the white levelers as those are not usable, but the ramps can be reused on the next set. And because we had to wait for our staircase to be installed, we still have a small section of Durock to lay. Here you can see we left about an 1/8 inch gap around the staircase, and this is for expansion and contraction. But if you want to see a more detailed process of how to lay Durock and install it, please refer to last week's episode as we go into a lot more detail. But now let's get back to laying tile.
So now that we have the stairs installed, we were able to finish laying our Durock, and now we can start tiling again, but instead of continuing going into the living room, we're going to make all of our cuts and finish the perimeter of this room. So let's get started.
If you have a lot of cuts to make with your tile, I highly recommend getting a wet saw. Here we got this one from Home Depot, and it was a well worth purchase, and I'll also link this one down in the description as well. There was a small amount of setup required, but it was for the most part pretty much plug and play, and then it was finally time to start cutting tile. Here we used a scrap piece of a different type of tile just to make sure the saw was working properly, and as you can see, this has a sliding table and the saw is static in place, and this makes it a lot easier to cut tile precisely. If you're only going to be doing straight cuts along the tile, there are manual tile cutters out there, so you don't need to buy such an expensive saw. However, if you are going to be cutting around odd corners and odd shapes, this saw definitely comes in real handy. And speaking of odd shapes, we had a lot of floor vents to cut around in this particular room, and I found the best way to do this was to make multiple cuts as close together as you can, maybe about 1 centimeter or so apart, and then you can take a hammer or whatever you have laying around and knock those pieces out, and they should break along the edge. And then from there, you can go back to the saw and clean up that line so it's nice and straight and also square to the sides. We are now cutting all the tile for the perimeter of the room, and everything's going well. We had a cut here, that went okay, and now we're on to this vent, which is going to be tough because the entire rectangle is within one tile, and so it's going to be basically a hole in the tile, but it's going to be a little bit difficult to properly mark out and cut precisely. So let's get to it. For cuts like these, I prefer to put the tile directly in place and kind of just line it up by eye, and then I use a speed square to transfer those marks to the center of the tile. And this is definitely where the saw comes into play, as you can drop the blade into place as you can't start the cut from the very edge, so you kind of have to start it in the middle, and you just kind of have to line it up by eye and you just gotta take your time with it. And here I'm cutting those edges. I went down as far as I could, but I obviously couldn't go all the way, as then I would cut too far. And then here I made some crosshairs to hopefully weaken the tile a bit when I go to break it. Well, try again. Try again we did, and we did finally get the cut to work, although it was a bit frustrating so I didn't capture it on camera. But the solution was to make additional cuts on the back side of the tile to weaken it to the point where you could break it without breaking the rest of the tile, obviously. And here we're filling in all those gaps along the edges, and the reason that these are here is because we just wanted to lay full tiles at the beginning and do all these cuts later. However, I recommend honestly to make the cuts as you go, because filling in the mortar in these small tight spaces was a bit tricky and a bit messy, and it was just more cleanup in the end. And in last week's video, we cut the cedar back a little bit so we could slide the tile underneath for a seamless look, and here you can kind of see how that works. And this avoids us having to cut a jagged edge around the tile to go around that wood or install some sort of baseboard, and I think it looks really nice and clean and really happy with the way this turned out. Okay, so now we're filling in all of this perimeter and we're making a lot of cuts on these tiles, and we want to get everything accurate. And so I laid this tile in. There's no mortar under this. As you can see, it nicely slides under the cedar wall, and then I put spacers here so I know this is the exact position it's gonna go once we put the mortar on. And now I'm gonna mark with my Sharpie where it lines up with this vent to make that cut. It's a lot easier to do that than try and measure it with the measuring tape and then put your marks back onto the tile. I just like to do it all in one shot. So let's get to it. So here are my 2 marks, and then I just measured how deep I need to go, and that's 3 inches, so I'm gonna use the speed square to mark it out. So it's 7 inches from here to here. I wanna factor in an 1/8 inch grout joint here and an 1/8 inch grout joint here, so subtract a 1/4 inch. So I'll mark this at 6 3/4. And here we just had to barely trim down the fireplace gas line so the tile could fit. Alright, so we just finished cutting all of the pieces that go through here, and down here, and we had to take them all out because we still need to put our mortar in. But when we took them out, we oriented them in the same pattern. So as you can see, this piece will go right there, and as you can see, it goes along the wall into the corner, and then there's the vent, which is right about there. So this will be easier when we go to place them down. And now we're beginning cutting all of these pieces, and then we should be good to go. So here, as you can see, we were able to complete the entire perimeter of this kind of kitchen and living room area. This took a lot of work, and as I said earlier, it's definitely better to just do all your cuts as you work your way through, but we were finally able to get it done. And now that this room was nearly complete, it was on to starting on the living room. First, we need to clear it all out. I made sure to take my time here on the tiles that were butting up against the stairs, as I wanted them to be perfectly level with the staircase. And here's something not to do. You do not want to finish a row in the middle. You want to finish it on one of the either edges so you can finish with a cut. But luckily here, all of our garage joints still came out to 1/8 inch, so we were all good. And this here was quite the puzzle piece to cut, but it did fit nice and perfect with an 1/8 inch reveal on all sides.
Alright, it might be a bit hard to see, but I have a laser here. You can kind of see it on my arm, and it goes all the way down the floor. And what I'm doing is lining it up with the seams that I've already established with the tiles that we've laid, so that I can mark out with a Sharpie this same seam all the way down, and then I can use those Sharpie marks to then measure the distance off of this wall behind me, and I can pre-cut all those tiles without having to lay a full row to see what that measurement is. I can just pre-cut it, and that way when we mix up the mortar, we don't have to do a bunch of cuts in the middle. We can just lay everything's already ready to go. So as you can see, we laid a ton more rows, but also we're kind of cornering ourselves in as we can't get to and from the living room and the front door. So we built a little bridge here, and this board's just long enough to get across, but this is all we need, and then tomorrow the mortar will be dry and we can walk on it.
And now we are going on to this hallway and closet section, and although it's quite small, there are a ton of cuts to make. And as you can see here, we did all those in advance and laid them all out on the floor. That way when we mixed up the mortar, it wasn't going to dry out before we finished laying all the tile. And if you've made it this far into the video, I hope you've enjoyed it so far. And if you could, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. We post a new video every single Saturday. And today actually marks 1 year of posting every Saturday. This is video number 52, so I'm quite proud. Not sure if I'm going to be able to keep this up every week, but I'm really proud to at least have hit this achievement so far. But anyway, I hope that deserves a like, or I hope that deserves a subscription. Anyway, back to the video. And after laying the last row here in the hallway, it was finally time to mix up our last batch of mortar. And as you can see, my dad's wearing a coat there because when we started this project, it was pretty warm outside, and now it's already getting below freezing. So this project has taken some time, but as you can see here, the very last row is about 6 inches, so half a tile, which is nice, so that way you're not, installing a small sliver of 1 inch or less on that last row. It looks nice and pleasing to the eye. And I just wanted to mention that we also have an Instagram and TikTok if you want to stay even more up to date on the progress of this lake house. So after many long hours and about 800 square feet of tile, it all comes down to the final piece. Pretty small, if you ask me.
Last tile.
Here we go.
800 square feet later.
Last time. Oh, Dad, it's the wrong corner.
Just kidding.
All right, job well done. Look at that floor out there.
So with that, we are done with all 800 square feet of tile. But stay tuned next week as we're going to show you guys how to grout it all. It's not as easy as you might think. And as always, thanks for watching and happy building. See you next week.